Good morning, friends. Glad that you are worshiping with us. We are the Journey Fellowship, and this is what online gathering looks like. I hope that you've been able to sing and pray and greet and welcome one another. And we encourage you to continue to utilize those online tools, to invite a friend, to give an offering, to participate with us as the church. I'm thankful for each one of you, the encouragement, the pictures that were sent in this week of us being the church. We're going to share those on our social media streams this week. And so if you have not yet been our friend on Facebook or followed us on Instagram, followed us on Twitter, if that's more your cup of tea, we're utilizing all of those streams to keep in contact, and we'd love for you to be a part of those. We have been, as a church on Sunday mornings, walking through the book of Colossians, and we're going to continue really for several more weeks throughout the month of April and on into May. What we have been seeing is that Paul said to us, the writer of the book of Colossians said to us, that God had a mystery that had been throughout time, and that when Jesus came, it was revealed, and that was that Jesus, post-resurrection, right, and then he ascends into heaven, now comes and dwells in us. And Paul said it this way, he said, Christ in us is our hope of glory, right? That our life and our salvation and our future and our hope are all tied to the reality that Jesus now dwells in us. I think it would be helpful for us to think about, it's a religious word, a theologic word, called righteousness. Here's what I mean by righteousness, because it's not a word that maybe some of us know or understand very well. And that's that every single person throughout history wants to feel a certain way. What we want to feel is we want to feel good about ourselves. We want to feel like I accept me. And what we mean by that, how that works, is we come to some conclusion about what is the baseline, what's the standard, what's my own expectation of myself, that if I will conduct myself in a certain way, if I will think a certain way, if I will behave a certain way, then I can accept myself, and I can think that I am living in the right sort of way. That's my righteousness. Now, for most of us, that begins in relationship with our parents, right? As children, we grow up, and the things that our parents think are important and the thing that our parents don't think is important, the behaviors that our parents find acceptable or unacceptable, we operate inside of their framework and structure. And over time, as we become teenagers, usually, it happens in those sorts of years, we begin to go, I'm not sure my parents' standards are my standards. I'm not sure I believe everything that they believe. And we begin to create a new set of standards for our righteousness. And then we go to college, or we get married, and now we're interacting with them, and now we have our own children, and we wander through life, and good stuff and bad stuff and tragic stuff, and right, life happens. And at each sort of moment along the way, we're almost constantly evaluating, is this standard of righteousness that I have made for myself good or bad? Is it enough? Do I really believe it anymore? One thing I read this week said that it's often as people enter into a counseling relationship, or they read a self-help book, or sometimes even as they find Jesus, that our evaluation of what does righteousness mean. So sort of every world religion, every philosophical thought and idea says to us, gives us a different standard of righteousness. Now, the central idea of what we call the gospel, right, the good news of Jesus, is that inside of biblical Christianity, we're not finding our own standard of righteousness, but that God has provided one for us, but that we have no ability, right? We lack the ability to meet that standard of righteousness. That we are all sinners who, in Romans it says to us, fall short of that standard of righteousness. But again, the good news, the gospel, is that Jesus met the standard of righteousness and gives to us, right? We're freely gifted the reality that because he met the standard, he gives us the acceptance. He gives us, right, that feeling of I am enough, not because of what I did, but because of what he did. So let's take it even a step further. And I think it's not until we see that we can't measure up, that we have no means or methods of actually meeting the standard of righteousness, that we can never earn it and never deserve it, that we'll never meet it, that it's in that moment that we can approach Jesus and say, I can't get this on my own, and so I need yours. I need your record. I need your effort. I need your work. I need your perfection, Jesus. That's my only hope. And it's in that moment that we find that because we can't meet it, because Jesus has, we get the free gift of eternal life rooted and wrapped in him. Jesus told a story to help illustrate what we're trying to talk about this morning. It's a story that maybe you've heard of before. It's the story of the prodigal son. It's a story about a dad. He's apparently a guy of some means and some wealth. He has two sons, an older son and a younger son. And they've got probably some sheep, right? Some land. They've got assets and resources. And one day the younger son comes to him and says, Dad, I don't want to work for you anymore. I don't want to be responsible to be here on the farm anymore. What I want is, I want the assets and resources that would be mine when you died. I want my inheritance now. I'm leaving. The dad didn't have to do that, but he chose to. So he sells off the things that he would need to sell off so that the younger brother can get his share and leave. And so that's what the younger brother does. He leaves. It says to us in the text, right, that he goes and he lives in squanderous ways. And he lives loose and fast. Women, food, drink, right? He is unwise in his friend choices, unwise in his monetary practices. And he comes one day to the end of his resources, and so he's got to go try and find a job. He'd lived in privilege, and so he probably was not the best worker. He finds himself one day, he's been feeding pigs. And he looks up and he sees what he's feeding the pigs, and he realizes that the pigs are living and eating better than he is. And I'm sure that it was not in a single moment, but over a course of moments, he would have come to the realization that the servants, the slaves, right, the people who worked for his father lived and ate and, right, slept way better than he was in that moment. And so he says to himself, I'm going to go home. I'm going to beg my dad for a job. I'm going to beg him to just treat me like a servant. And at least then I'll have my basic needs met. And so he does. He goes home. And the text says to us that while he was sort of still far away, right, the father who's been watching for his arrival sees him coming, runs to him. And before the son, right, that son, the younger brother, wants to get out the words, Dad, I'm willing to work for you. I'm willing to do all this stuff. Before he can even get those words out, the dad is saying to the workers, get a robe, wrap it around him, get a ring, slide it on his finger. We're going to throw a party. The fatted calf, the one that we've been saving and waiting for the best day, right? For the biggest party. That moment has arrived. We're going to kill that calf. We're going to have the party tonight. Invite all the friends. Invite all of the neighbors. And it feels like, right, when you're reading through the story that's where it should end. That's how God, right, clearly God is talking about here's where the sinners and they get to return home. But there's a second half of the story. It's helpful, I think, to know that Jesus was telling this story to some religious leaders, some guys who thought their own standards of righteousness were being met. They had lists of things to do, lists of things to not do. They thought they were pretty good at it. They surely thought that they were better than those sinners over there. The ones that were the prostitutes and the tax collectors, the ones that were greedy, the ones who stole money from other people, the ones who didn't follow their lists of what to do and what not to do. And so Jesus continues and he starts talking about, in the second half of the story, the older brother, the one who had stayed, the one who had been continuing to work. That brother has a problem. He approaches his dad. He won't go into the party, and he says to his dad, listen, why are you treating this guy this way? It gets a little more complicated because I want you to think about this. because the inheritance had been sold, right? The stuff, the assets and resources had been sold, and the father had already given the younger brother his portion. When the younger brother shows up and he wraps a robe around him, what he's really doing is taking the older brother's robe and wrapping it around the younger brother. When he slides a ring on his finger, he's taking the older brother's ring and he's sliding it on the younger brother's finger. When he kills the fatted calf and throws the giant party, he's taking the party from the older brother. And so on one level, we might go, maybe the older brother does have a point. But I think what's important, and I think what Jesus was trying to say, is that the older brother missed it. What the older brother should have done was pursued and gone after the younger brother. The older brother should have, at his own expense, loved and cared for the younger brother enough to done this himself and to treated him in this way. I think what Jesus was trying to point to was himself. Jesus was saying, do you not see and recognize and understand that the perfect older brother has come? That at my cost and my expense, I'm going to give you the gifts. You squandered it. Your sinfulness has ruined and destroyed all of these things. But what I'm going to be as your true older brother is the one who lavishes the gifts. I'm going to give you my righteousness. Instead of saying, these things are mine, I bought them at a great price, and so I'm going to hold on to them. He says, these things are mine. I've bought them at a great price. The cost, in fact, is going to be my very life, and I love that Dad gave them to you. Jesus covers the cost of our being welcomed into the family. He paid the debt. He died for our sins, and it even goes a step further. He didn't just pay our debt, but he earned our reward. He lived perfectly. He loved and served and sacrificed. And so now we don't just get our debt paid, but we get welcomed into the family, and our full inheritance, our full share of inheritance is our gift. Our big brother is looking at us. We've shown up at the door. We smell like pig poop. Our pockets are empty. We've squandered everything. All of our attempts, all of our own standards of righteousness have been failures. We don't measure up at all. And instead of slamming the door, instead of shaming us, instead of telling us, if you go get cleaned up enough, if you get yourself washed up enough, if you work enough days, weeks, months, years, instead of getting angry at Dad for opening the door, instead of demanding that we act like slaves and earn in our way, he says, welcome. He says, put on my robe of righteousness, wear my ring of glory. You're welcomed into the family. The righteousness that he earned is wrapped around us so that as the Father now looks at us, he sees us as a most loved son. Now, what does this mean? What this means is that we don't get to the Father through our own righteousness. We don't wrap our own good deeds and our own good stuff around ourselves. We don't just live perfectly. We can't. We stop stealing our self-acceptance from power and achievement and popularity. So how do we get it? Like, what do we do with this? How do we figure out our own identity in the midst of this? If Jesus is the one who has done the work. As we read Colossians chapter 3. We're going to read verses 12, 13, and 14 here in just a second. I want you to see that our righteousness, on one hand, this is sort of a two sides of a coin thing. On one hand, is bestowed upon us, right? It's wrapped around us in Jesus. And on the other hand is it is some things that we do. It is a becoming that is happening to us and in us. Well, let's look at Colossians and see if maybe this helps. Colossians chapter 3, verse number 12. We're going to read just the beginnings of it as we think about our identity. Paul says, put on then, right? Wrap yourself in the robe. See yourself in this way. Put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved. That's our identity. That's what we're gonna wrap around ourselves this morning. Those of us who are followers of Christ, those of us who have been born again, are those who are now his chosen ones, holy and beloved. As we think about how do we take this on, how do we root ourselves here, the first step of this is, I think we're supposed to be who we are, right? We're supposed to be God's chosen ones. We're supposed to be holy. We're supposed to be his beloved. Now, this isn't a perfect illustration. There's some things I don't maybe like all of the theological ramifications of the illustration, but I'm hoping that it's helpful to us. If you think about our identity, one of the things I read this week said that our identity is often perceived in layers. So think about it this way. You might be a man who is a lawyer, who is Irish, in the sense that, right, his grandparents grew up in Ireland. You might have a wife. You might have 2 children. You might have, you might live here in Sunbury, Ohio. And you just sort of layer upon layer upon layer. You might be a guy who really likes golf. You might be a guy who roots for the best team in the United States of America, the Ohio State Buckeyes. You might, right? We keep building layer upon layer upon layer of our identity. And as you think about all of those layers, some of them are way more important to us than others. So you might, right, it depends on who you are and where you're at. For most of us, right, if our grandparents were Irish, might be something that we would say, here's who I am. But it's not going to be something that matters to us. We might not have ever even been to Ireland. We probably don't even know the village where our grandparents grew up at. And so while that maybe is a fun fact about us, in the layers and the levels of our identity, it isn't very close to the bottom. It's just sort of one of those things that sits up at top. But we do have things that sit down at the bottom. And that might be your job. Maybe it's that you're a lawyer, right? It was the crowning achievement of college and law school and acceptance. And, right, we've gotten into a practice and maybe we're on our way to being a partner, and it fills that cup of identity for us. And the thing that might shake us would be if that was taken away or if that was in jeopardy or in harm. It's why in these days of social distancing and quarantining, right, that for many of us, those things that we have at the bottom layers and levels of our identity have been taken and shaken and called into question. So we're not real sure what to do. And in many ways, we're not even sure who we are. But take the illustration a step further. Imagine that you are someone who has come into a relationship with Jesus. In the beginning, that's going to be one of those things maybe towards the top because we're not sure about all of the ramifications of it. We don't maybe even understand it all of the way. We just know that we had needed a Savior, right? We needed a Jesus to move into our lives. We heard that maybe being spiritual was going to be helpful, and so we're trying that out. But it isn't the thing that's down at the bottom. But over time, Christian maturity is the process of that Jesus layer, right, descending closer and closer to our foundational place, to the spot that is where we find our identity, where we find our purpose, where we find our hope and our joy, the spot that we stand even when things are really starting to wrestle and struggle. Now, I hope you get the sense, right? This isn't an instant process. This isn't something that happens sort of automatically. It's the sort of thing that takes time, years, maybe even decades for us to get to the spot where that Jesus thing really is the spot where we stand. And so it's as we figure out that those other things, those things that we've been counting on and depending on, can't do it. They can't sustain us. They can't carry us. And even as we talked last week, right, as we try to root ourselves into those things and the winds of life blow, and we topple over, we go, well, that didn't work. It's in that process that we figure out, boy, Jesus is the thing that I can count on. He is the thing that when I send my roots in and I depend on him and I count on him and I build my life on him, that it is sustainable. He is the spot that we want to rest. So we want to the first step, we want to be who we are. That's in many ways a recap of the last several weeks. We want to rest in that new identity. We are now his beloved, holy, in who Jesus has made us to be. The step 2, though, is how do we wrap ourselves in the Jesus robe? Keep reading there in Colossians chapter 3, verse 12. Well, let's begin again. Put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved. Now here are the things we're going to put on. Here are the things we're going to wrap ourselves in. Compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other. As the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. And above all these things, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. Now, there can be some confusion here, so stick with me. Notice that at the beginning of verse 12, right, Paul calls them holy. He says that it's their identity. They're pure and blameless and perfect and spotless. They've already been washed clean. He says, you're holy and you're beloved. But then he says, now put on compassion. Put on kindness. Wrap yourself in humility. Be someone who's growing in love. Be someone who's willing to forgive. Now, if you were already finished being holy, you wouldn't have to put it on. There's an already, but not yet. We use that phrase sometime, and here's where we see it. On one level, right, on one side of the coin, Paul is saying, you are pure and holy and spotless and blameless. But on the other side, you're still growing, you're still becoming compassionate and forgiving and kind and meek and loving. We have to wrap ourselves with the robe that we've already been given, that we already possess. We have the holiness robe. And Paul is saying, now wrap yourselves in it. Put it on in a daily way, in a moment-by-moment way. Grow in your Christ-likeness. Right? Again, he's in us. We've got access to the resource of Jesus. So we want to grow in these sorts of ways. We're already seen, the Father has already declared us holy and pure and blameless. If we die, right, if we're ushered into eternity, when he sees us and looks at us, he sees Jesus upon us. He sees us washed by the blood. But we are still in the process of becoming. We've been declared justified. Our righteousness has been given to us. And we are in the process of being sanctified, where we're putting on the robes of Jesus. That's the second step. Because we have the freedom and the incentive, because God has already looked at us, right? We get the freedom and the joy of becoming more and more like Jesus. It's only in light of the acceptance, it's only in light of the love and Jesus' pursuit of us that we can actually live it out. It's only when we're freed from, right, the pursuit of our own righteousness, our failure, right, we don't measure up, we don't come, and we go, I can't do it, so I'm gifted it in Jesus. Now, because it's been gifted to us, now we can pursue it. Let me just close our time with just a couple of sort of short examples. We could go through each one of those. I'm not going to do that for the sake of time, but just a couple of the list of those things, right? Compassion and forgiveness and kindness. Let's just look at a couple of those. Let's think about compassion. Just really practically, how do we live this out? How do we bring that layer into our life, as it were? You know, when Jesus says, right, there's a spot in the Gospels where Jesus says, when I was hungry, and you didn't feed me, I was thirsty and you didn't take me in. What he's really saying is, the way in which you treat those people, those that are hungry, those that are poor, those that have less than we do, the way you treat those people will tell whether or not you know that you're a sinner saved by grace. See, when we think that it's our own righteousness, our own goodness, our own success, our own pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps, the way in which we treat those people tells us whether or not we're full of gratitude in our heart towards Jesus, whether we think basically that God is giving me what I've earned and deserved. But like the Pharisees, right, that Jesus was trying to teach, we think of ourselves like those older brothers who've been working really hard. Why wouldn't God give me the fatted calf? Why wouldn't God reserve the best stuff for me? But as we treat others with compassion, as we pour out in generosity our gifts towards the people who are around us, compassion comes from knowing that we are loved freely, that it was a gift that was given to us, and that we know we are already holy in Him, that allows us then to be compassionate. Think about humility, and we'll finish here. Humility, most of us have this thing that gets called an ego, right? We've got an opinion about who we are, about what we deserve, about what we've earned, about our value, about our place in the world. And when we are getting tossed about, we're living in those days, right, when who we are and what we think about ourselves and what we've been holding on to is getting sort of tossed about and about and about. Well, maybe it's because you're getting extra criticism. Maybe because you're spending too much time with your kids or your wife, or too much time away from those spots where you've been getting your cup filled up. And it takes us down, right? The criticism takes us down, sort of layer under our layers. And now we're feeling bad about ourselves, and we're feeling criticized, and we're feeling like those things that we've been counting on have been stripped away from us, and we're down to -4 in our how do we feel about ourselves? And we're going all the way down, and it's getting worse, and it's getting worse, and it's getting worse. And then all of a sudden we get some compliments, right? We get an attaboy. We figured out some new way and new technology and some new thing, and we've got our entrepreneurial spirit going in the midst of coronavirus, and we've got this thing, and we start to get some attaboys, and maybe your mom called you on the phone and told you what a great guy you were, or maybe maybe one of your kids looked at you and said that was the best casserole you've ever baked, or maybe a good friend looked at you and said, boy, I really appreciated the note, right? You're getting the compliment and the thing, and now we're going up and up and up. That's not humility. That's not, we've missed it. The gospel tells us that our problem is really much worse than we think, right? We're way worse off than we thought. Our means of righteousness were much worse at accomplishing them than we imagined that we were. But the gospel also tells us that in the midst of that, Jesus loves us way more than we thought He did. That He isn't looking at our means of righteousness, but at Jesus' means of righteousness. And this means that the worst criticism becomes tolerable and the best compliment gets to be left behind. Why? Because we are finding our identity in something much greater. See, humility comes from knowing that we are holy and dearly loved. And that while we're in the process of becoming, while we're wrapping ourselves in those robes of Jesus' righteousness, while we're growing in these other ways, our humility is found in identifying ourselves in Jesus. It's not that we think poorly of ourselves. It's not that somehow we're underneath someone else's sort of boots and shoes. But it's that as we identify ourselves as the holy beloved one of Jesus, that we don't need to find it other places, and so we can think about ourselves less. The criticism and the compliment don't toss us about anymore. My friends, this morning I pray that you would be someone who is putting on the robe of Jesus' righteousness. Maybe at the very beginning, you need to ask for the Father to redeem you. That the work that Jesus has done on the cross would be the spot you could find your righteousness. And for those of us who have found it there, may we flip to the other side of the coin, and may we do the work out of the relationship of growing in compassion and forgiveness and love. Friends, I pray you have a great week. I look forward to the day when we can be together. Please send me some of those pictures of you and your family and your friends. Be the church this week. We love you. We'll talk to you soon.